Take up your cross and follow me. How many of you wear a cross? How many of you have one at home, but you don't wear it publicly? How many of you have it tattooed on your body? The cross in our culture is a somewhat beautiful symbol. We have it in our churches, we wear it on our bodies, we decorate it, we imbue it with all sorts of meaning. Every culture has their own beautiful version of crosses, vining crosses, even bar crosses, the tri-bar cross. In Rome, the cross meant one thing. It meant death as a rebel. Not death as a criminal. There were plenty of ways to execute criminals in ancient Rome. And Rome did not hesitate to use them. But the cross, death on a cross, had one meaning. It meant that you had risen up in violent rebellion against Rome, and you had failed. You were a violent rebel who failed in your mission. Just a story a few lines ago in the Gospel of Mark preceding this moment between Jesus and Peter, Peter had gotten it right. Peter had turned to Jesus, who had asked, "Who am I?" And Peter said, with all the enthusiasm that imbues everything that Peter says, "You are the Messiah." He probably meant something along the lines of, "You are the one who is going to get us out of this situation." Jews were living under a violent and oppressive yoke of Rome. There were lots of crosses to be seen throughout Israel because the Jews were a rebellious people and were not interested in living under the yoke of a violent government. And so they rose up and in violence resisted that government. And they failed over and over and over again. The story of Maccabees, from which Hanukkah arises, is a story of a violent rebellion crushed by a Roman Empire. An empire that wasn't interested in fractious individual cultural groups with their own particular odd religious practices governing themselves. Crosses were everywhere, and they were a sign of defeat, a sign of violent rebellion and of violent defeat. And Peter probably has something along the lines of this in mind. He may not have been one of the disciples advocating violent overthrow. There were lots of different ways of rebelling against the Roman government and the oppression of their own leaders who were often complicit with the Roman government. But what seems pretty clear is Peter had an idea of who Jesus was as the Messiah, and Jesus getting up and starting to talk about how he was going to die a rebel on a cross did not fit. Peter was not interested. Jesus might not have actually been all that interested, given the grief he expresses and anguish he expresses as he walks this path. But to be sympathetic with Peter also, Jesus' declaration that he will die as a rebel on a cross and that we are all called to die as rebels on that cross seems a little bit strange, because we have no evidence that Jesus was fomenting violent revolution. What we have is story after story of Jesus healing people, of Jesus liberating them from their demons, of Jesus restoring people back to community. And it is so easy for us to think, oh, it's such a benign message. It's so unthreatening. But for those of you who advocate for health care for all, exactly how well has that conversation gone in our country? For those of you who advocate for a penal system that is entirely different, perhaps even the abolition of it, how well does that conversation go in this country? For those who advocate that perhaps we should put down our tools of violence, our guns, how well has that conversation gone in this country? Advocating for the healing and the care of people threatens the status quo. It threatens how people think the world should work. Jesus says, take up your cross. Rome says, take up your sword. Our culture says, take up your sword. Our nation was birthed in violence. It was birthed in violence to protect money, property, tea. That's our legend. Our nation is birthed in violence, and we use violence as our primary tool. We use it in wars abroad. We used it to settle who is human. We use violence to settle that argument. We use violence to silence protesters. We use the violence of shame and humiliation on a regular basis. Violence permeates our world. Shaming one another permeates our world. Fear and the fear of violence permeates our world. Trayvon Martin was shot because somebody believed he was a danger, and our laws protect the belief that you may stand your ground. If you want to read a book on the evolution of our laws and stand your ground, I highly recommend reading Kelly Brown Douglas, an Episcopal priest, an African-American woman who wrote an amazing and disturbing book about the evolution of our laws that protect the property of those considered worthy of owning property, which is mostly white folk. It permeates all of our history, and our willingness to use violence, whether as a culture or as individuals, is seen as a sacrosanct right. Because that's how the world works, right? Through violence. And yet, Peter has been witnessing Jesus engaged in non-violent acts. But disturbing acts, complicated acts, acts which poke the bear. Over and over and over again, Jesus pokes the bear by insisting that the world we live in should be a place where everybody can flourish, where everybody's bodies can be healed and cared for in the way they need to be cared for, where food should be available for all, where everybody should have a community to be a part of. If you read the weekly, you already got a little tidbit of what's about to come next. But I love starting Lent with the confession. I love this season that we have set aside where we begin our service by repenting of sin. And it's not because I think the entire service should be shaped by our sin. It's because by confessing our sin at the beginning, we are reminded that in the beginning, we are created in God's wonderful and amazing image. And because of that, because we are loved by a God who is in us and through us and in all things around us, we are able to do the thing that in our culture is the hardest thing to do. Admit that we are vulnerable. We hide our vulnerability in so many ways. We hide our vulnerability by standing armies that protect areas of land that aren't even remotely close to our borders. We hide our vulnerability by ensuring that those people who are criminals are simply removed, not rehabilitated. That is not the goal of our penal system. We remove vulnerability by hiding our elderly in places where we can't see them, by not talking about the death that is inevitable and in front of all of us. We hide our vulnerability by nodding our heads when somebody mentions that author that we have no idea who they're talking about, but we're like, oh yeah, that was a great book. Oh yeah, I've heard about that. Frantically Googling, who is that person? We do it in grand ways and small ways. Our lives are invested in keeping vulnerability at bay. But my bet is that the relationships that you have, where you can actually share that vulnerability, those are safe relationships. Those are the places where you know that that person who sees you as you are, they're going to love you even though they know that you're the one who always leaves stuff out on the counter. You're the one whose damp towel crowds out their dry towel. You're the one who gets stressed and defensive when your house is full of boxes. Some of us know that quite intimately right now. We put so much time and energy into hiding our vulnerability, and yet the relationships where we can truly be ourselves are the ones where people know our vulnerability and love us already. Some of us know that well enough that we have gotten out of relationships where our vulnerability is not safe. But this thing that we do every Sunday, this gathering, it's not just to hear music and eat some bread and drink a little bit of sip of sherry. We gather to practice being the people that God has created us to be. And one of the ways that we practice that is by sharing our vulnerability. Because of all the places in the world where we should be safe, it should be here. Because this is the place called together by God, who is safe. God who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. A God whose justice is mercy. That is a God who knows who we are, knows how we screw up, and just keeps on loving us and inviting us to live free from the anxiety and the fear which causes sin. We live in a culture that thrives on fear. We're about to head into a presidential race where fear is going to be all over the place. Vote for me because I will keep you safe from. Fear is the language of our culture. It is the language of our leadership. And fear causes so much anxiety. And anxiety causes sin. Anxiety causes us to hold, to cling, to want things to be in a particular way and only a particular way, to be safe. The problem isn't that we want safety. The problem is that we make the world unsafe for others by how we seek safety. And so we start Lent by confessing things we have done and left undone. And then it is my privilege as a priest to get to stand up and say, we are forgiven. We are forgiven. You didn't have to do it right to be forgiven. I'm not even convinced you actually have to say the confession to be forgiven. Because what I really believe is that we already stand in the forgiveness of God, who sees who we are, who gives us the space to be who we are, and then invites us into the rest of this liturgy. The rest of the liturgy, where we get to come and pray for one another, where we get to share our celebrations and birthdays. Yes, we'll do it again this Sunday. Where we get to pray for the joys and the sorrows that we have, where we sing together, where we eat together. All of this is trying to teach us the kind of habits to live the rest of our life with. And so when Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, Jesus is calling us to a life of care, of love, of healing, of liberation. And the reality is, just as in Jesus' time, just as with figures like Martin Luther King, just as with Rosa Parks, just as with Oscar Romero, all of these people chose to speak the truth of liberation, and they suffered, and some died as a result of it. Jesus' death on the cross is not some grand plan of making God satisfied, as if God needs punishment for our sins. Death on the cross is what happens when you stand up against a system that wants you dead in some other way, and a system that wants the people around you subservient, obedient, doing their jobs. Most of us are probably not going to die as a result of our faith. Most Christians actually haven't died as a result of their faith. Many have. What makes them Christians is not the death. It is the life that might lead to that death. So taking up your cross is to live a life in rebellion against injustice, against violence, using nonviolence, using persistent efforts to heal and love, persistently seeking the flourishing of all around us, and learning how to do that in a community where we do our best, but don't always succeed, in being vulnerable, in being truthful about who we are and where we are and what we want and what we need, and holding that in kindness and in love, hearing one another, so that we together, by loving one another, can become the people that God has made us to be. So friends, take up your cross and follow Jesus. Amen.